Welcome. In this video, we're taking a calm journey into the life of Barack Obama, the 44th President of the United States and the first African American to hold that office. But before the speeches, before the campaigns, before the history books were written, there was just a boy. A boy born between worlds, raised across oceans, searching for belonging in places that felt both like home and somewhere foreign. His story begins not in Washington or Chicago, but on a tropical island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and then in the humid streets of Jakarta, and then back again. We'll walk through the quiet moments of his childhood, the small details that shaped who he would become. The dinners around tables, the classrooms, the beaches, the questions that children ask when they're trying to figure out where they fit. So relax, settle in, and let's drift back to August 1961, to a hospital in Honolulu, where a story begins that no one could have predicted. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments where you're watching from. Let's begin. The air in Honolulu is different from anywhere else. There's a softness to it, a warmth that wraps around you like something gentle and constant. The trade winds come in from the ocean, carry-rowing salt and the faint scent of plumeria flowers. And even in the hospitals, even in the sterile rooms where babies are born, you can feel it. That sense of island time, of something slower and more forgiving than the mainland allows. On August 4th, 1961, in Kapiolani Maternity and Gynecological Hospital, a woman named Stanley Ann Dunham gave birth to a son. She was 18 years old, white, from Kansas originally, though her family had moved around. Her father had named her Stanley because he'd wanted a boy, and she'd carried that name her whole life with a kind of bemused acceptance. She was unconventional, curious, the kind of person who asked questions that made others uncomfortable. The father was Barack Obama Sr., a man from Kenya, from the Luo tribe, who had come to Hawaii to study economics at the University of Hawaii. He was older than Anne, confident, brilliant, with a voice that commanded attention when he spoke. He had a wife and children back in Kenya, though Anne didn't know this when they married. Or perhaps she knew and chose to believe in something else, in the possibility of a different kind of life. They named the baby Barack Hussein Obama, after his father. Barack means blessed in Arabic, a name that carried weight, that suggested something hoped for. The marriage wouldn't last. Within a few years, Barack Sr. would leave for Harvard, would return to Kenya, would become a distant figure, more myth than father. But in those first moments, in that hospital room with the warm breeze coming through the windows, there was just a mother and her son, and the unknown future stretching ahead. Anne's parents, Stanley and Madeline Dunham, called Gramps and Toot, Hawaiian slang for grandmother, were there too. They were good people, salt-of-the-earth Midwesterners who had come to Hawaii chasing something, maybe opportunity, maybe just the dream of somewhere different. Gramps sold furniture, told jokes, had big ideas that didn't always pan out. Toot was more practical, would eventually become a vice president at a bank, steady and reliable. They would become the most consistent presence in young Barack's life, the anchors when everything else shifted. The Hawaii of the 1960s was a unique place. It had only become a state in 1959, still carried the feeling of somewhere in between, not quite America, not quite something else. The population was a mix of native Hawaiians, Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, Filipino Americans, Portuguese, whites from the mainland. Race meant something different there than it did in most of America. People mixed, married across lines. And while prejudice certainly existed, it wasn't the stark black and white division of the mainland, especially the South. For a mixed-race child, Hawaii was probably the best place in America to grow up during that era. Not perfect, but more forgiving, more accustomed to complexity. Barack's early childhood was split between two worlds. First, there were the years with just his mother and grandparents in Hawaii. Anne was young, still figuring out her own life, trying to finish her education while raising a small child. They lived modestly in apartments, and Gramps and Toot helped however they could. Young Barry, as everyone called him, was a cheerful kid. Photos from that time show a smiling boy with a big afro, wide eyes, that kind of open expression children have before the world complicates things. He spent time at the beach, played in the parks, went to a local school called Noelani Elementary. He was observant, even then, watching how people interacted, listening to the stories Gramps told, absorbing the way Toot kept the household running with quiet efficiency. Anne was pursuing her studies in anthropology, becoming fascinated with Indonesia, with development economics, with how societies organize themselves. She was idealistic, believed in human potential, in the possibility of making the world better through understanding. And then she met another man, an Indonesian named Lolo Sitoro. He was also a student, calm where Anne was passionate, practical where she was idealistic. They fell in love, married, and in 1967, when Barack was 6 years old, they moved to Jakarta. Imagine being 6 and leaving the only home you've known. The beaches and the familiar streets, your grandparents' house, your school, your friends. Getting on a plane and flying thousands of miles to a place where everything is different. Jakarta, in the late 1960s, was a developing city, still recovering from political upheaval. Indonesia had gone through a violent transition of power just a few years earlier, and the country was poor, still finding its footing. The streets were unpaved in many areas, crowded with motorcycles and bicycle taxis called becaks. There were open sewers, the smell of cooking food and exhaust mixed together. The sound of the call to prayer echoing from mosques 5 times a day. For a boy from Hawaii, it was jarring. The heat was more oppressive, heavy and humid without the ocean breeze. The house they moved into was more modest than what he'd known, though Lolo worked hard to provide for them. He got a job with an oil company, and slowly they moved to better neighborhoods, got a house with a bit of yard. Lolo taught Barry things, how to be tough, how to handle himself. Indonesia wasn't an easy place, and Lolo believed the boy needed to learn resilience. He taught him basic boxing, how to take a hit and not cry, how to stand up for himself. There was a practical harshness to it, born from Lolo's own experience growing up in a country where you learned to adapt or you struggled. But there was also wonder. Barry had a pet ape for a while, a creature named Tata. There were chickens in the yard, and once a baby crocodile. The neighborhood kids played in the streets, and Barry joined them, learning Indonesian, eating street food, playing soccer, which everyone there called football. He went to local schools, sat in crowded classrooms, learned a different rhythm of life. His mother was teaching English to Indonesian students to help make ends meet. Every morning before dawn, she would wake Barry up and teach him using American correspondence courses, determined that he wouldn't fall behind in his education. that he would maintain his connection to American learning, even while living abroad. She would sit with him at 4:30 in the morning, before he went to his regular school, drilling him in English, in math, in American history. Barry would complain, groggy and resentful of the early hour. But Anne was insistent. She had a vision for her son, believed he could do anything, be anything, and she wasn't going to let circumstances limit him. In 1968, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Maya, Barry's half-sister. She was a sweet child, and Barry loved her fiercely, took his role as big brother seriously. Now there were 4 of them, a blended family in a place that felt both exciting and foreign. But something was shifting in Anne. She was growing disillusioned with her marriage, with the compromises of daily life. Lolo had become more focused on career advancement, on practical success. And Anne still carried her idealism, her belief that life should be about more than just getting ahead. They were growing apart, in the way that people sometimes do when their fundamental views of the world don't align. And Anne worried about Barack's education. The schools in Jakarta were fine for local children, but she wanted more for him. Wanted him to have the opportunities she'd had. Wanted him to be able to compete in America if that's where his life led. So in 1971, when Barack was 10 years old, she made a difficult decision. She sent him back to Hawaii to live with his grandparents and attend Punahou School, one of the best private schools in the state. She and Maya would stay in Indonesia with Lolo for a while longer. But Barack would go back, would return to the islands where he'd been born. Imagine being 10 and making that journey, saying goodbye to your mother and little sister, getting on a plane alone, flying back across the ocean to grandparents who were familiar but who you hadn't lived with in years. Starting over again at a new school, trying to figure out where you belonged. Punahou was a beautiful campus, green and sprawling, with old buildings and modern facilities. It was prestigious, expensive, and Barry was there on scholarship, his tuition paid by his grandfather's boss, a Jewish man named Charles Payne, who believed in helping kids get good educations. Most of the students at Punahou were wealthy, came from established island families, had the easy confidence that comes with privilege. Barry was one of only a handful of black students in his grade. He was the new kid, living with his grandparents in a modest apartment, not quite fitting the mold of what Punahou students were supposed to be. And he was entering that complicated age, the early teenage years, when identity becomes something you think about constantly, when you start asking yourself who you are and where you fit. His grandparents did their best. Gramps drove him to school, came to his basketball games, told him stories about the mainland, about the war, about life. Toot worked at the bank, brought home a steady paycheck, made sure there was structure and dinner and homework time. They loved him completely, but they were white. They were older. And they couldn't entirely understand what it was like to be a black boy in America, even in diverse Hawaii. His mother and Maya eventually returned to Hawaii too, though Anne and Lola would divorce. Anne threw herself into her graduate work, her research, and eventually spent more time in Indonesia doing field work, always pursuing her intellectual passions. Maya grew up between worlds too, but she had her mother more consistently present. For Barack, adolescence at Punahou was a time of searching. He was athletic, played basketball with increasing skill, found some identity in being part of the team. Basketball was a language he could speak, a place where ability mattered more than background. The sound of the ball on the hardwood, the rhythm of practice, the camaraderie of teammates. It gave him something solid, But he was also dealing with questions that didn't have easy answers. What did it mean to be black when your mother was white and your father was absent? What did it mean to be American when you'd spent years in Indonesia? What did it mean to be yourself when you didn't have a clear model to follow? His father came to visit once when Barack was 10, just before he went back to Hawaii. Barack Sr. arrived in Honolulu for a month, stayed with them, and the boy tried to reconcile the myth he'd built in his mind with the reality of the man. His father was impressive in some ways, still intelligent and commanding. But there was also disappointment. The recognition that this man was essentially a stranger. That the relationship he'd imagined didn't really exist. His father gave a talk at Punahou during that visit, spoke to Barry's class about Kenya, about Africa. The kids were impressed, and for a moment, Barry felt proud, felt connected to something larger. But then his father left again, returned to Kenya, and that was it. They would never see each other again. Years later, Barack would learn that his father's life had taken difficult turns. The brilliant promise hadn't translated to sustained success. There were problems with alcohol, with relationships, with career disappointments. His father died in a car accident in Kenya in 1982, when Barack was 21, and they never had a chance to build an adult relationship. But during those teenage years at Punahou, Barack was just trying to navigate each day. He made friends, went to parties, discovered music, listened to Stevie Wonder and Marvin Gaye, tried to understand what it meant to be cool, to fit in. He experimented with marijuana and some drinking, the kind of teenage rebellion that was common enough, but that he'd later write about with regret. Recognizing it as a way of avoiding deeper questions about himself, he read voraciously. James Baldwin, Ralph Ellison, Langston Hughes, Malcolm X's autobiography, Webb Du Bois. He was trying to understand Black identity, Black history, trying to find a narrative that made sense of his own experience. Hawaii didn't have a large Black community, didn't have the kind of cultural touchstones that existed in places like Chicago or Atlanta or New York. He was figuring things out largely on his own, through books and imagination. There was a moment, a small moment that stayed with him, that he'd write about later. He was watching TV with his grandfather, and there was a segment about a Black man who had chemically lightened his skin. The man looked unnatural, damaged, and young Barack felt something twist in his stomach. A recognition of self-hatred, of trying to be something you weren't. His grandfather changed the channel, uncomfortable, and they didn't talk about it. But Barack lay awake that night, thinking about what it meant to be uncomfortable in your own skin, thinking about acceptance and identity. His relationship with his grandparents was complex. He loved them, knew they loved him. But there were small tensions, small moments where difference showed itself. Toot was sometimes afraid of aggressive Black men she encountered, would occasionally make comments that revealed her own racial fears, even as she loved her Black grandson completely. Gramps tried to connect, took him to meet a Black man named Frank, who was a poet and activist, someone who could talk to Barack about race in America. Frank was from the mainland, had experienced Jim Crow, and he shared stories that opened Barack's eyes to the reality of racism beyond Hawaii's more casual acceptance. High school passed. Barack played basketball, got decent grades, moved through the rhythms of adolescence. He graduated from Punahou in 1979, was heading to college, was on the verge of leaving the island again. He'd applied to Occidental College in Los Angeles, a small liberal arts school, partially because a girl he'd met from Punahou's sister school was going there. It wasn't Harvard or Yale, wasn't the most prestigious choice. But it was California. It was the mainland. It was the next step. In those last months before leaving, Barack would walk on the beaches of Waikiki sometimes, looking out at the ocean, thinking about everything that lay ahead. The water was the same water he'd played in as a small child, before Indonesia, before all the questions and complications. The waves rolled in with their eternal rhythm, indifferent to human concerns. And there was something calming about that, about the continuity of the natural world. He didn't know yet who he would become. He was just 18, just a kid from Hawaii with a complicated background and a lot of questions. He'd been blessed, had opportunities many didn't have, had grandparents who sacrificed for him, a mother who believed in him fiercely even when she was half a world away. The islands had given him something. A multiplicity of perspective, an ease with diversity, a sense that the world was bigger than any one narrative. He'd been an outsider enough to observe, but accepted enough to belong. He'd lived in different places, seen different ways of being, understood that identity was something you constructed as much as something given to you. As the plane lifted off from Honolulu, heading east toward California, Barack looked down at the islands below, at the green mountains and the blue ocean and the white beaches. It was all getting smaller, slipping into memory, becoming the foundation on which everything else would be built. He was heading toward a future he couldn't imagine yet, toward a life that would take him to Chicago and Harvard and the Illinois Senate and the U.S. Senate and eventually to the White House. But right then, in that moment, he was just a young man leaving home, carrying questions about identity and belonging, about purpose and meaning, about who he was and who he wanted to become. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with their calm efficiency. The plane reached cruising altitude, and Barack opened a book, probably something by Baldwin, or maybe a textbook for the classes he'd take, and began to read as the Pacific Ocean passed beneath him, vast and endless, connecting all the places he'd been, all the places he'd go. Los Angeles in 1979 was sprawling, smoggy, endless in a way that felt both exciting and overwhelming. Occidental College sat in Eagle Rock, a neighborhood northeast of downtown, with a small campus that felt intimate compared to the size of the city surrounding it. Spanish-style buildings, palm trees, students who came from all over, seeking education and reinvention in equal measure. Barack arrived with his questions still unanswered, his identity still something fluid and uncertain. He went by Barry still, that easier name, that nickname that didn't carry the weight of his full name, that didn't require explanation. He moved into the dorms, met his roommates, attended orientation events with all the other freshmen who were pretending to be more confident than they felt. College is supposed to be where you find yourself, or at least that's what people say. It's supposed to be the place where you explore ideas, meet people different from yourself, figure out what matters. And for Barack, Occidental became a place of experimentation, of trying on different versions of himself to see what fit. There were parties, of course. He fell in with a crowd that drank, smoked, stayed up late having the kind of intense conversations that 18-year-olds have, where you solve all the world's problems between midnight and dawn, and then wake up fuzzy-headed with nothing actually resolved. He played pickup basketball, went to classes with varying levels of enthusiasm, dated, tried to be cool in the way that college kids do. But there was something else happening too, something beneath the surface. He was becoming more political, more conscious of the world beyond his own immediate experience. This was the early 80s, the Reagan era. And there were students on campus organizing around issues: divestment from South Africa, nuclear disarmament, economic justice. There were professors who challenged students to think critically about power and systems, about who benefited from the way things were structured. Barack started attending meetings, listening to the activists, the students who seemed certain about their positions, who had clear enemies and clear causes. He was drawn to it, to the sense of purpose. But he was also observing, still figuring out what he actually believed versus what sounded good in a heated discussion. He became friends with students of color, found a community among the Black students, the Latino students, the international students who also carried that sense of being from somewhere else. They talked about identity, about racism, about what it meant to be a minority in America. These conversations felt important, felt like they were getting at something real. There was a divestment rally during his sophomore year, and Barack spoke at it. It was his first real public speech, and he felt the power of it, the way words could move people, could create connection. He talked about apartheid in South Africa, about the complicity of American institutions in sustaining injustice. His friends were impressed, told him he was good, that he should do more of this. But afterward, Barack felt strange about it, felt like he'd been performing somehow, playing a role. Was he really an activist? Or was he just someone trying on activism the way you'd try on a jacket? The uncertainty bothered him, the sense that he still didn't know who he was underneath all the poses. He thought about his father during this time, about the stories his mother had told him. His father had believed in something, had returned to Kenya with ideals about building a new Africa, about using his education to serve his country. It hadn't worked out the way his father had hoped, but at least there had been conviction. At least there had been purpose. Barack started writing during this period, keeping journals, trying to work things out on paper. He wrote about race, about identity, about feeling split between different worlds. The writing was private, not polished, just a way of thinking through the confusion. And then, partway through his sophomore year, he made a decision. He wanted to transfer, wanted to be in New York, wanted to be in a bigger city with more diversity, more intensity. He applied to Columbia University and was accepted. He would finish his undergraduate degree there, in Manhattan, in the middle of everything. The move to New York in 1981 was another fresh start. Another chance to remake himself. Columbia was Ivy League, prestigious, serious. The campus sat on the Upper West Side bordering Harlem, and Barack found an apartment off campus, a small place where he could have some solitude, some space to think. New York was different from anywhere he'd been. It was dense, fast, indifferent to any individual's existence. You could walk through crowds of thousands and be completely alone, invisible. The city had an energy that was exhausting and exhilarating. The sound of sirens and subway trains and street musicians, the smell of hot dogs, and exhaust and garbage and perfume, all mixed together. Barack became more solitary during his Columbia years. He was studying political science and international relations, spending long hours in the library, reading theory, reading history. He would walk through the city, through different neighborhoods, watching people, thinking about systems and structures, about how cities worked, who they worked for. He lived modestly, worked part-time jobs to help pay expenses. There was a summer where he worked at a construction site, hard physical labor, working alongside men who treated him with a kind of casual acceptance. No questions about where he came from or what he was studying. Just work, sweat, lunch breaks, where they'd sit on concrete and eat sandwiches and complain about the foreman. He ran in the morning sometimes, through Riverside Park along the Hudson, watching the sun rise over the city, the way light changed the buildings from gray to gold. Running was meditative, a way of clearing his head, of having time alone with his thoughts. His mother was still in Indonesia, still doing her anthropological research, passionate about her work, trying to understand how development projects affected village communities. They wrote letters back and forth, and Anne would encourage him, tell him she was proud, remind him that he had the potential to make a difference. She believed in service, in using your gifts to help others, and she wanted that for her son. His relationship with his grandparents remained strong, though they were far away now. He'd call Toot sometimes, just to hear her voice, to check in. She was still at the bank, still the steady presence she'd always been. Gramps was getting older, still telling his stories, still trying to sell furniture, still dreaming his dreams. During his junior year at Columbia, Barack started thinking more seriously about what he wanted to do after graduation. Law school was an option, a path that made sense, that would lead to career stability. But it felt like a default choice, like what you did when you didn't know what else to do. He'd been reading about community organizing, about people like Saul Alinsky, who had developed methods for helping poor communities gain power and agency. The idea appealed to him. This notion that you could work at a grassroots level, help people organize themselves to address their own problems. It wasn't about swooping in as a savior, but about facilitating collective action. There was something about it that resonated. Maybe it was his mother's influence, her belief in human dignity and potential. Maybe it was his own searching for purpose, for a way to connect his personal questions about identity with something larger, something useful. He applied for organizing positions after graduation, sent out letters to organizations in different cities. Most didn't respond. The field wasn't exactly booming with opportunities, especially for someone with no experience. Just an Ivy League degree and some vague idealism. But then he got a call from a man named Jerry Kellman, who ran a church-based organizing group in Chicago called the Developing Communities Project. They needed someone to work in the South Side, in neighborhoods that had been devastated by steel mill closures, where unemployment was rampant and hope was in short supply. The pay was tiny, barely enough to live on. But it was a job, it was organizing, it was a chance. Barack graduated from Columbia in 1983 and spent a year working at a consulting firm in Manhattan, trying to save some money, still figuring things out. The corporate world was comfortable in its way, predictable, but it felt hollow, felt like he was wasting time. So in 1985, at 23 years old, Barack bought a beat-up old car and drove to Chicago, to the South Side, to neighborhoods like Roseland and Altgeld Gardens, to start work as a community organizer, making $13,000 a year. Chicago's South Side was another world. These were historically black neighborhoods that had been built around industry, around the steel mills and factories that had drawn black families up from the South during the Great Migration, promising jobs and a better life. For decades, that promise had been real enough. People had worked hard, bought homes, raised families, built churches and communities. But by the mid-'80s, the mills were closing, the jobs were disappearing, and the neighborhoods were struggling with unemployment, crime, deteriorating housing, schools that were failing. There was anger and frustration, a sense of abandonment, of promises broken. Barack rented a small apartment and started his work. It was harder than he'd imagined. Community organizing sounds noble in theory, but in practice, it meant knocking on doors in neighborhoods where people were suspicious of outsiders, attending church meetings where people were more interested in internal politics than collective action, trying to get people to come to gatherings where you'd teach them how to identify problems and develop strategies to address them. A lot of doors got slammed in his face. A lot of people told him they didn't have time for meetings. They were too busy trying to survive. A lot of initial meetings had disappointing turnout. Just a handful of people sitting in a church basement, looking skeptical. But Barak was patient. He listened. That became his greatest skill, just listening to people's stories, their frustrations, their hopes. He'd sit in people's living rooms and let them talk, really talk, about what was happening in their lives. He'd attend church services, multiple churches, getting to know the pastors who were the real power brokers in these communities. Slowly, he started to make progress. He helped organize a group of residents in Altgeld Gardens, a public housing complex, to pressure the city to remove asbestos from their apartments. It was a small victory, but it mattered. The residents had organized themselves, had discovered they had power when they worked together. He helped set up job training programs, worked with churches to create after-school programs for kids, facilitated meetings where residents could voice concerns to city officials. None of it was glamorous. Most of it was grinding, thankless work that moved in tiny increments. But Barak was learning. He was learning how power actually worked, how change actually happened. Not through grand speeches or revolutionary moments, but through slow, patient organizing, building relationships, helping people find their own agency. He was also learning about Chicago, about its neighborhoods and its history, about the deep segregation that divided the city along racial lines. The South Side was almost entirely black, separate from the white neighborhoods, separate from the downtown prosperity. And that separation wasn't an accident. It was the result of decades of deliberate policy, of redlining and housing discrimination, of decisions made by people with power. The winters were brutal. Chicago in January was a special kind of cold. Wind cutting off the lake, temperatures well below freezing, snow piling up in dirty gray heaps. Barak would stand at bus stops, waiting, stamping his feet, watching his breath fog in the air, wondering if he was accomplishing anything. He made friends during this time, other organizers, people working in the neighborhoods. They'd meet for coffee or beers, compare notes, support each other through the frustrations. There was a camaraderie in the work, a sense of being part of something meaningful, even when the progress was hard to see. He dated occasionally, but nothing serious. His life was consumed by the work, by the problems of the communities he was serving. He'd go to sleep thinking about strategies, wake up thinking about who he needed to call, what meeting needed to be arranged. The churches became central to everything. In the black community, churches weren't just places of worship. They were community centers, social networks, political organizations. The pastors had real influence, could mobilize people, could lend credibility to causes. Barak learned to work with them, to speak their language, to understand the particular dynamics of church politics. He attended Trinity United Church of Christ sometimes, led by a pastor named Reverend Jeremiah Wright. Trinity was large, influential, and Wright was a powerful preacher who talked about social justice, about the black experience in America, about faith as a call to action. Barak was drawn to it, to the energy of the services, the sense of community. He hadn't been religious growing up. His mother was secular, his grandparents nominally Christian, but not particularly devout. But he was beginning to understand religion differently, not just as belief in doctrine, but as a source of community, of moral language, of collective identity. One Sunday, after a particularly moving service, Barack went forward and joined Trinity, was baptized, became officially a Christian. It was a significant moment, a public declaration of belonging, of connection to the Black church tradition, of faith in something beyond himself. Years later, this membership would become controversial, would be used against him politically. But in that moment, in 1987, it was simply a young man finding community, finding spiritual grounding, finding a place where he felt he belonged. His organizing work continued. There were successes and failures, small victories and frustrating setbacks. He helped to get a job center established, worked on education reform initiatives, brought together coalitions of churches and community groups. The $13,000 salary never got any bigger, and he was scraping by financially, but the work felt important. But he was also beginning to feel limited. As an organizer, he could help communities identify problems and pressure institutions to respond. But real change required being inside those institutions, having actual power to make decisions and allocate resources. He couldn't change policy from the outside, couldn't address the systemic issues that were at the root of the problems he was seeing. He started thinking about law school again. Not corporate law, but public interest law, civil rights law, the kind of legal work that could complement organizing. He could learn how the system actually worked, gain credentials that would open doors, position himself to make change at a larger scale. He also thought about politics. Chicago was a political town, and he'd been watching how it worked. The aldermen and state representatives and the machine politics that ran everything. Maybe that was the path. Maybe that was how you actually got things done. It was a hard decision. He'd come to Chicago to do organizing, had invested 3 years in it, had built relationships, and started projects that needed continuity. Leaving felt like abandoning people who had trusted him. But Jerry Kellman and the other organizers encouraged him. They told him to go to law school, to develop more skills, to come back with more tools to help. The work would still be there. So Barack applied to law schools, to Harvard and Yale and other top programs. His grades from Columbia were strong, his LSAT scores were good, and he wrote essays about his organizing work, about wanting to use law as a tool for social change. He got accepted to Harvard Law School, one of the most prestigious law schools in the country. The decision was made. He'd go to Cambridge, Massachusetts for 3 years, study law, and then figure out what came next. Before he left Chicago, he took a trip to Kenya. He'd been thinking about his father more, about that missing piece of his identity. His father's family was still there, his grandmother, aunts, uncles, half-siblings he'd never met. His mother encouraged him to go, to connect with that part of his heritage. The trip was profound. He met his grandmother, Sarah Obama, a woman who lived in a small village, who welcomed him with tears and joy, who told him stories about his father as a boy, about the family history. He met half-siblings, Alma and others, who shared some of his father's features, some of his mannerisms. He traveled through Kenya, saw the poverty and beauty, the complexity of a post-colonial African nation, trying to develop amid corruption and tribal politics. He visited his father's grave, stood there in silence, felt the weight of connection and loss. The trip gave him something. Not answers exactly, but a sense of completeness, of having touched all the parts of himself. He was American, but he was also connected to this place, to these people. He carried both, could be both. When he returned to the United States and prepared to move to Cambridge, he felt different, more grounded, more certain about his path. He'd spent his 20s searching, experimenting, trying different versions of himself. Now he was heading into law school with a clearer sense of purpose. Harvard awaited, and after Harvard, who knew? Maybe he'd return to Chicago, to organizing or politics. Maybe he'd do civil rights law. Maybe something else entirely. The path wasn't perfectly clear, but it felt like it was emerging, like he was moving towards something rather than just running from confusion. On one of his last nights in Chicago, Barack walked through the neighborhood where he'd spent 3 years organizing. The streets were familiar now, the buildings, the churches, the faces of people who'd greet him. It had been hard work, often frustrating, but it had shaped him, taught him things he couldn't have learned anywhere else. He thought about the people he'd worked with, the residents who had organized themselves, who had discovered their own power. That was the real victory, not any particular policy win, but the transformation that happened when people realized they weren't helpless, that they could act collectively to change their circumstances. The Chicago wind blew cold off the lake, carrying the smell of industry in the city. Barack walked back to his apartment, packed the last of his boxes, prepared for the next chapter. Behind him were the islands of his childhood, Indonesia, Los Angeles, New York, Kenya, and now Chicago. Each place had given him something, shaped him, added layers to his understanding of himself and the world. Ahead was Cambridge, was law school, was the future still unwritten. He was 27 years old, and he was finally beginning to understand who he was and what he wanted to do with his life. Los Angeles in 1979 was sprawling, smoggy, endless, in a way that felt both exciting and overwhelming. Occidental College sat in Eagle Rock, a neighborhood northeast of downtown, with a small campus that felt intimate compared to the size of the city surrounding it. Spanish-style buildings, palm trees, students who came from all over, seeking education and reinvention in equal measure. Barack arrived with his questions still unanswered, his identity still something fluid and uncertain. He went by Barry still, that easier name, that nickname that didn't carry the weight of his full name, that didn't require explanation. He moved into the dorms, met his roommates, attended orientation events with all the other freshmen who were pretending to be more confident than they felt. College is supposed to be where you find yourself, or at least that's what people say. It's supposed to be the place where you explore ideas, meet people different from yourself, figure out what matters. And for Barack, Occidental became a place of experimentation, of trying on different versions of himself to see what fit. There were parties, of course. He fell in with a crowd that drank, smoked, stayed up late having the kind of intense conversations that 18-year-olds have, where you solve all the world's problems between midnight and dawn, and then wake up fuzzy-headed with nothing actually resolved. He played pickup basketball, went to classes with varying levels of enthusiasm, dated, tried to be cool in the way that college kids do. But there was something else happening too. Something beneath the surface. He was becoming more political, more conscious of the world beyond his own immediate experience. This was the early 80s, the Reagan era. And there were students on campus organizing around issues: divestment from South Africa, nuclear disarmament, economic justice. There were professors who challenged students to think critically about power and systems, about who benefited from the way things were structured. Barack started attending meetings, listening to the activists, the students who seemed certain about their positions, who had clear enemies and clear causes.
And so, we've reached the end of another history story. I hope this journey through the calm waters of the past has relaxed your mind and prepared you for a peaceful sleep. Thank you for sharing these moments with me as we get lost together in the depths of history. Each video is a story from the dusty pages of the past, and each story is crafted to be a lullaby just for you. If you enjoyed this video and it helped guide you towards sleep, please don't forget to hit that like button to support me. Subscribe to the channel to discover more of history's monotonous yet mesmerizing tales and drift off to sleep each night with a whisper from the past by your side. Make sure to turn on notifications so you'll be instantly alerted when new videos are uploaded. Feel free to share in the comments which historical topics you'd like to hear about. Every suggestion you make could inspire the next video. Now gently close your eyes, take a deep breath, and surrender to the night. I wish you peaceful nights, sweet dreams, and a wonderful sleep in the embrace of history. Until we meet again on our next historical journey. Good night.